Hercule Poirot and the Hat That Returned. Alone. Chapter 1. The Hat on the Stairs. Evening had fallen with English punctuality over the Hampshire countryside, turning the gardens of Beechwood Manor a melancholy gold. The trimmed bushes cast long shadows across the perfectly manicured lawns, and the night cicadas were beginning to tune their choruses. From the glass-enclosed veranda, Mrs. Althea Cardew held a glass of sherry with bony fingers, staring blankly down the path that led to the gated entrance. Then he saw it, or, more precisely, he saw it again. There, on the first step of the front steps, rested the hat. A black bowler hat, impeccably preserved, dust-free and wrinkle-free, with a satin ribbon that gleamed faintly in the twilight. There was no wind, there were no footsteps, and yet the hat had returned. Mrs. Cardew took a step back, the sherry glass trembling in her hand. This was the third time in 5 days. Always at dusk, always on the same step, and always, invariably, it disappeared into the night without anyone. Not servants, not gardener, not even her niece Daphne, seeing it being removed. Pressing her lips together, she reached for the phone. Her fingers dialed awkwardly, but her voice was firm as she said, "I'm sorry, but I'm not sure what to say. Connect me to London. I want to speak to Monsieur Hercule Poirot, the Belgian detective." 2 days later, a chauffeur-driven black car slowly descended the beech-lined avenue leading to Beechwood Manor. Inside, Hercule Poirot, immaculate in his light grey suit with a neatly folded handkerchief, gazed at the landscape with polite disinterest. At his side, his trusty leather briefcase contained the essentials: a moustache brush, a notebook, and a box of Belgian chocolates. "Mon cher Hastings, if you were here," he murmured somewhat melancholy, "you would no doubt be speculating that a hat is not enough to justify my journey. But I assure you, when an inanimate object shows its own will, there is always a human behind it pulling the strings." The chauffeur, oblivious to the soliloquy, opened the door with a measured bow. Mrs. Cardew was waiting in the hall, flanked by her niece Daphne, a young woman with brown eyes, a pale face, and a permanently tense expression. "Monsieur Poirot," Althea said with the gravity of an uncourtly queen, "thank you for coming. I warn you, what you are about to hear sounds like nonsense, but I fear that what began as a silly game may have darker consequences." Poirot bowed slightly. "Madame, everything strange is worthy of attention, and I trust you are not exaggerating." They were led to the gallery, where tea and oatmeal biscuits were served. Daphne remained silent, her hands clasped in her lap. Althea explained the matter of the hat with dry, unadorned precision. "And there's no note, no letter, nothing but the object itself, always at the same time, always in the same place." Poirot nodded, folding his hands in his lap. "Can I see the hat? He disappeared as usual this morning, but Daphne photographed him yesterday. I thought it was prudent." Daphne nodded silently and went to look for the portrait. Poirot took advantage of the pause. "Who lives here currently, madam?" "My niece and I. The staff, Mrs. Inglethorpe, housekeeper, Mr. Harrow, gardener, Miss Cattell, lady-in-waiting, and young James, who helps with maintenance, all long-time employees, except for James, who has only been here 3 weeks. Poirot raised an eyebrow. At that moment, Daphne returned with the photograph. It was a clear image, the bowler hat, perfectly symmetrical on the stone step. Curious, Poirot murmured. And you say he disappears at night? Exactly. And no one has stood guard? Althea exchanged a look with Daphne. We tried. Daphne stayed up until 1, and then Mrs. Cattell took over. They heard nothing, and by dawn the hat was gone. Poirot stroked his moustache. Could I see the staircase? Perhaps also the gallery from which you observed him? Of course. As they walked through the mansion's corridors, Poirot noticed the details. Clocks that didn't keep accurate time, footprints on the carpet, a slightly crooked vase. On the stairs he paused. "Madam," he said softly, without taking his eyes off the first step. "Are you sure the hat doesn't belong to anyone here?" "Absolutely. I would have recognized him." Poirot bent down slowly, examining the edge of the step. So maybe the hat doesn't want to come back. Maybe, madam, it is brought back by someone who wants to be noticed. Daphne, for the first time, spoke. What if it's not just about the hat? Poirot turned his head towards her. Explain yourself. Mademoiselle, she hesitated. 2 nights ago, I felt someone watching me from the woods. I didn't see anything, but I heard a low laugh, and the day before, my favourite brooch disappeared from the dresser. I thought I imagined it, but now I don't know. Poirot slowly straightened up. His eyes were shining. Madame Cardew, I believe your hat is merely a salute warning, and in his voice there was an ominous certainty that chilled the air of Beechwood Manor. Chapter 2. The Collection of Secrets. The next morning arrived shrouded in a thick fog that hid the contours of the forest and blurred the boundaries between the house and the outside world. Hercule Poirot ate a meticulous breakfast in the dining room of Beechwood Manor, accompanied by Mrs. Cardew and her niece. The poached eggs were perfectly cooked, the toast was evenly browned, everything was just the way he liked it. Madam, he said, carefully placing the coffee cup back on its saucer, this house is elegant, yes, but also quiet. Too quiet for a place where things disappear, where hats return of their own accord, and where young women hear invisible laughter. Althea didn't respond immediately. Daphne, however, looked away. Could you do me a favour, madam? Poirot continued. I'd like to interview the inhabitants of the house personally. Not that I suspect anyone, of course. Never. But every soul has its secret, and secrets like mice come out when one makes no noise. Althea nodded with an austere gesture. I'll have them reported to the library, except for the gardener. He's working outside until noon. Poirot smiled. Perfect, and I'll start with Miss Cattell, if you don't mind. Miss Myrtle Cattell was a woman of indeterminate age, thin as a reed, with round glasses and hair pulled back in a bun that seemed held together by sheer will. She entered the library with a rigid posture, as if every joint had been set by a governess from another century. Do you know why they called you? Poirot asked pleasantly. Yes, sir, the matter of the hat, although I must say I've never given credence to fantasies. Poirot tilted his head. Fantasies, mademoiselle? Objects appearing and disappearing. Laughter in the dark. Where are we? In a Gothic novel? No. In my opinion, this is all a set-up to attract attention. Who do you suspect? Miss Cattell sat up even straighter. Miss Daphne, without a doubt. She spends her nights writing poetry that she doesn't show to anyone. She walks the halls like a ghost, and she has that exaggerated sensitivity. A young woman like that needs to be the centre of something. Poirot made a discreet note in his notebook. The interview ended with curt courtesies and not a hint of warmth. Next up was young James, tall and robust, with a freshly tanned field and a frank if slightly restless look. He came in with his hands still stained with dirt. "Monsieur Poirot, I heard you wanted to speak to me. I hope it's not about the damn hat." "No, no, Mr. James. I just want to better understand those who live in this house. Tell me, how has your stay here been since you arrived?" James shrugged. "Quiet? Too quiet, if I'm honest. Mrs. Cardew barely speaks to me. And Miss Daphne, well, she barely dares to look me in the eye. There's a tension in the air, as if everyone is expecting something bad." Poirot nodded slowly. "Have you noticed anything strange? Objects out of place? People where they shouldn't be?" James rubbed his neck. "The tool shed. A few days ago I swore I locked it, and the next day the door was open and a flashlight was missing. I thought the gardener had taken it, but he denied it." "And you didn't say anything? To whom?" "Here, secrets are buried carefully." Finally, Poirot was greeted by Mrs. Inglethorpe, the housekeeper, a robust woman with a deep voice and a firm character. She examined Poirot with a clinical eye. "Do you have any theories, Monsieur Poirot?" "Too soon for that, madam. I only have observations, and observations, like seeds, blossom with time. What I can tell you is that Mrs. Cardew holds more secrets than you could possibly imagine. This house was the scene of tragedy even before your time. Your husband died here, under curious circumstances." Poirot straightened up. "Curious? Yes. Officially it was a heart attack. But there was a storm that day, and Mr. Cardew was found in his office with a broken window and with a hat that wasn't his on the table." Poirot stood. "Still, a hat? Yes, a black bowler hat, just like the one that's been appearing." When the clock struck 12:15, Poirot went out for a walk in the garden. The sun had dissipated the mist, but the atmosphere was still oppressive. He turned the corner of the path and stopped, in front of the tool shed. There, hanging from a nail by the door, was the lantern James had mentioned, spotlessly clean. Poirot didn't touch her. He just watched and smiled. People forget that tools also listen. In the distance, a figure appeared between the trees and disappeared again. It was impossible to distinguish whether it was a man or a woman, but Poirot no longer had any doubts. The hat was not a simple prank. It was a message, and someone was waiting for him to figure it out. Chapter 3. The Invisible Guest. Evening was slowly falling over Beechwood Manor, tinting the gallery's stained glass, windows with amber hues. Hercule Poirot, after his morning stroll, had politely requested a small table facing the window, from where he could see both the woods and the path through the gardens. There he was now, a notebook in one hand and a tiny cup of coffee in the other, immersed in thoughts he shared with no one. Althea Cardew approached quietly, accompanied by Daphne, who looked even paler than the day before. "Monsieur Poirot," Althea said, "you have received a letter." Poirot raised an eyebrow. A letter? It was on the silver tray this morning. The envelope has no return address, just your name, in black ink and neat handwriting. Poirot took the envelope unhurriedly. He examined it, weighed it in his hand, even smelled it, before opening it with the tip of his fruit knife. He extracted a single sheet folded in 3. He unfolded it. The hat will keep coming back as long as what was hidden is not remembered. Ask for the East Wing Lounge. It still smells like rain there. An invisible witness Poirot didn't say a word. He simply folded the paper and placed it carefully in his inside pocket. Then he turned to the women. "What is the East Wing Lounge?" Daphne blinked. Althea pursed, her lips before answering. It was the music room. It's been closed for years, because, after my husband died, he had his stroke there. It was a terrible night. The storm, the broken window, and that hat. Everything was out of place. I closed the salon the next day. I never went back in. The staff keeps it clean, but no one stays there for long. "Then, madame," said Poirot, rising, "I think it is time to return." The door to the East Wing parlour creaked like a jaw that hadn't opened in years. The air inside was cold, with a faint scent of damp and waxed wood. Despite the dust accumulated on the high mouldings, the room retained an almost theatrical atmosphere. A closed piano, an oriental rug threadbare around the edges, and next to the fireplace, an armchair upholstered in maroon velvet. Poirot crossed the room slowly, without touching anything. Then he stopped by the window. "Was this the broken window?" he asked. Althea nodded. Daphne stood in the doorway, as if she didn't dare go all the way inside. Poirot knelt down, looked at the lower keyhole of the frame, then at the wood next to the sill. He scratched with his thumb and brought the pad of his finger to his nose. "Does that smell, madame? Musty. And something else." "What do you mean?" Poirot stood up. "Rain, but not old rain. Fresh rain. Last night. This window was either open or closed improperly during last night's light storm. Someone was here, but no one's come in," Althea protested. "I check the doors myself every night." Poirot walked to the piano. He gently lifted the lid. A single note, low and gravelly, resounded in the room like a suppressed sigh. There was a fresh mark on the edge of the lid, a slight scratch, as if something heavy had been placed there. "Has the piano been played lately?" he asked. "No one. Not even me," Althea replied. "Not since Leonard died." Poirot carefully closed the keyboard. Then he turned slowly on his heels, as if the entire room were a frozen scene about to move if one blinked too hard. "Madam," he said finally, "you told me about previous tragedies, but you haven't mentioned whether your husband had any enemies before his death." Althea hesitated. Leonard had a difficult character. He was harsh with Daphne, disapproving of her artistic calling. He had some disagreements with the previous gardener, but enemies as such. "And you?" asked Poirot suddenly. "They? Do you have enemies, madam?" She looked at him coldly. "Are you insinuating something, Monsieur Poirot?" "Never, madam, but in crimes that are dressed in symbols, a hat, an anonymous letter, an open window. It's not enough to look for the obvious. You have to look for who the message is intended for." That evening, Poirot went out into the garden again. The air was cool, with a barely perceptible breeze stirring the leaves, like distant whispers, he headed back to the main staircase. And there, on the first step, just as before, was the black bowler hat. But this time there was something inside. Poirot knelt down. He gently lifted the hat and removed what had been carefully placed inside, a photograph, in black and white, old. It showed Mr. Leonard Cardew in the music room, standing by the piano. Beside him, a man with a sombre expression, a face Poirot had not yet seen. On the reverse, an inscription in shaky letters, "Not all ghosts are dead." Poirot stood motionless, staring at the photograph. The invisible guest, it seemed, had been there long before he arrived. Chapter 4. The Face Among the Trees. The photograph burned softly in Poirot's mind as the bowler hat now rested on a table in his room, like a chess piece placed awaiting the next move. That image, worn by the years, had opened a threshold. Leonard Cardew, still alive, barely smiling, and at his side a nameless man, with eyes that looked not at the camera, but at someone else off-screen. An invisible witness, perhaps, or another actor who should never have been part of the scene. Poirot spent the morning examining the back of the photograph under a portable magnifying glass. The ink on the message was modern, but the paper wasn't. The type of development suggested a photo lab at least 2 decades earlier. This wasn't an improvised forgery. This was a relic, and someone had kept it for years. After lunch, Poirot asked Daphne to accompany him on a walk through the woods. "You've lived here since you were a child, right?" she asked as they walked under the canopy of ancient trees. "Yes, I was born in this house, although I've never truly felt it was mine." "Why do you say that?" Daphne hesitated. "My Uncle Leonard was stern, like I said. My aunt tried to protect me, but there were things she couldn't avoid. This house has secrets. It always has. Hallways where you hear footsteps that don't belong to anyone. Doors that close without a breeze. But when you're a child, you learn to keep quiet." Poirot looked at her out of the corner of his eye. "And now that she's a woman? I'm still silent, but I'm listening better." They followed a narrow path that wound its way into the densest part of the forest. The air was thick with resin and humidity. Suddenly, Daphne stopped. "It was here, where I felt like I was being watched. The night of the hat's second appearance." Poirot approached cautiously, studying the ground. It wasn't mud, but the earth was still soft enough to reveal traces if one knew where to look. There were marks, small, superficial, almost erased by fallen leaves. But they were there, not from a shoe, from a boot. Poirot knelt, took a twig and carefully lifted a layer of leaves. "Look, mademoiselle, this branch, broken. And here, a crushed cigarette butt. Do you smoke? No. And your aunt? Never." Poirot picked up the cigarette butt with a handkerchief. It was a cheap cigar, one of those sold in packs at station shops. It didn't belong in the house. As he sat up, he saw something else. About 15 meters away, between the trunks, something was shining, a lens. He approached slowly, wordlessly. Daphne followed him, breathless. There, hanging from a branch at eye level by a thin, well-camouflaged wire, was a small device, a camera, "Oh, my God!" Daphne whispered. "What is that?" Poirot picked up the device, a portable surveillance camera, the kind activated by motion. It wasn't professional, but it was discreet enough to go unnoticed. It had been recording. This recorder was recently installed, just enough to record who leaves the hat, perhaps, or to make sure that they didn't see more than necessary. Daphne shuddered. "Do you think someone in the house?" "I don't know, yet. But there is someone else here, mademoiselle. Someone who knows this property better than you or your aunt." Back at the mansion, Poirot locked himself in his room with the camera. He connected the device to his own portable reader, brought from London as usual. The memory card contained 5 recent recordings. Most were mundane. Branches moved by the wind, a fox sniffing in the bushes, until he reached the last file. The image was grainy, nocturnal, but clear. At 3:42 a.m., a figure crossed the frame, tall, bundled up, her face partially covered by a scarf. She was carrying something, a hat. Poirot paused the video and zoomed in as far as he could. The hat was placed down carefully. The figure looked around, then walked away along the path hidden among the trees. Before disappearing, he turned to the camera for a second, and for a fleeting moment his face was seen, a face Poirot knew, but not from this house, but as of photography. That evening, Poirot requested a light supper and asked to speak privately with Mrs. Inglethorpe, the gardener, Harrow, who had finally returned from the market, and James, the young assistant. One by one, he asked them about Leonard Cardew. They all said the same thing, a difficult man, full of business and little emotion. But when Poirot discreetly produced the photograph, only one reacted. The gardener. An imperceptible twitch of the lips, a blink that lasted too long, and a silence that was too measured. Poirot didn't point it out, not yet. But that night, as he reviewed his notebook, he wrote only one line. "The face among the trees is not a stranger. It is the memory of something that should never have returned." Chapter 5. The man who didn't die at all night had fallen with a darkness thicker than usual over Beechwood. Not even the moon dared to pierce the thick mist rising from the woods. Inside the mansion, Poirot paced with his hands clasped behind his back, his footsteps muffled by the oriental rugs. His thoughts revolved in perfect circles, like the hands of an antique clock, the figure in the video, the face in the photograph, the hat that returned, and the complicit silence of the house's inhabitants. Too many pieces, and they still didn't fit. It was then that the door rang. A soft, almost timid knock. "Go ahead," said Poirot without pausing. It was Daphne. Her face looked restless, her eyes moving with the rapidity of someone who has made a decision after much debate. "Monsieur Poirot, I need to tell you something I haven't told you before." Poirot turned slowly. "I'm listening, mademoiselle." Daphne gently closed the door. She walked to the centre of the room and stood with her arms crossed. "My Uncle Leonard. He didn't die exactly like they say. I mean, yes, officially it was a heart attack. But that night, 2 saw him argue with someone, with a man I didn't know, in the music room." Poirot narrowed his eyes. "And why didn't you mention it before?" I was scared. My aunt told me not to talk about it, that it had been a hallucination caused by the storm. But I know what I saw last night. When I saw that photograph you found, I knew that the man from back then was the same one who appears next to my uncle. Poirot nodded slowly. Could you describe something more about him? His voice, the way he moves? Daphne closed her eyes for a moment. He had a scar. It ran across the left side of his neck. He spoke with an accent, northern maybe, and he had a very strange way of laughing. A low laugh, as if he didn't want anyone to hear it, but couldn't help it. Poirot didn't reply immediately. He walked to his briefcase and took out a small folder. Inside was an enlarged copy of the photograph. He spread it out on the desk. Are you sure? Daphne leaned forward. Her fingers trembled slightly as she pointed at the man next to Leonard. Cardew, completely. Poirot took a deep breath. Then, mademoiselle, I believe we've reached the heart of the mystery. That man, his name is Hector Blunt. Daphne took a step back. Who is it? A former business partner of your uncle. He disappeared 20 years ago after being accused of fraud in a joint venture. They ran. No one ever saw him again. It was assumed he died in South America, although his body was never found. But if you saw him that night, then Monsieur Blunt isn't dead. Or at least I wasn't. That revelation turned the house into a minefield of memories. Althea stiffened when Poirot mentioned Blunt's name. Who told you about him? Let's just say, madam, that he himself has decided to speak again, although not with words. Althea pressed her lips together. Leonard hated him. He believed I had betrayed him, but he never wanted to talk about it. He said the past should stay where it was. He forbade me even to mention his name. And yet, madame, the past rarely stays still, and in this case it has returned with a hat as its banner. That same evening, Poirot asked to see Gardener Harrow privately. He received him in the small room off the kitchen, where the fire was still crackling gently. Mr. Harrow, Poirot said without preamble, you recognize the man in the photograph. Don't deny it. I saw it in your face. And now I offer you the opportunity to tell the truth, before things take an irreversible turn. The gardener swallowed. All right, you're right. I recognized him, but I didn't know his name. I only saw him once, many years ago. I was an assistant here when Leonard was still alive. One night, I heard voices in the music room. I went over, out of curiosity. That man, Blunt, if that's his name, was with Mr. Cardew. They were arguing. Blunt was shouting something about stolen money and revenge. Then he saw me. He told me if I told anyone, he'd make me pay. So I kept quiet. Then Leonard died, and the man disappeared. And you never saw him again? Harrow hesitated. Not until a few days ago. But then I saw him. Among the trees, I thought he was a ghost. Until he left his hat. And why didn't you tell anyone? And they think I'm crazy? Besides, I didn't want to relive that. Some ghosts, it's better to leave them alone. Poirot nodded gravely. Sometimes, yes, but not when they're ready to kill again. When Harrow left, Poirot jotted one more line in his notebook, and all dead men are absent. Some lurk in the shadows, waiting for the crime to cool down, enough to become a rumour. And under that line, Another. Blunt didn't come for the hat. He came for what's left. No, naughty. Chapter 6. The secret in the false bottom the next morning was damp and grey, as if the weather reflected the invisible weight that enveloped Beechwood Manor. The woods seemed more dense than ever, the trees more vigilant, and the birds unusually silent. Poirot, faithful to his routine, got up before breakfast and walked with measured steps down to the music-room. This time he carried with him an unusual object, a small ebony-handled hammer wrapped in a handkerchief. When Bon Dionlieu reached the threshold of the living-room, he didn't turn on the light. He preferred the morning twilight, just enough to make out the outlines of the furniture. He walked straight to the piano, examined it carefully, and then knelt beside its left side. He gently tapped the wood with his hammer. Tock, tock, tock. A dull sound, then a subtle change. Tock, clock. Poirot smiled. So, with surgical precision, he removed a decorative plaque that had been improperly fitted from the start. Behind it was a hidden compartment the size of a shoebox. Inside, wrapped in black cloth, he found a lacquered wooden object. He gently lifted it. A jewellery box. Antique, heavy, with delicate marquetry, and clearly, carefully hidden. Poirot slowly sat up, placed the jewellery box on the piano, and opened it. Inside, he found 3 objects: a gold chain with a broken medallion, a wad of old banknotes wrapped in a faded paper band, and a letter sealed with black wax. Hours later, having read the contents and carefully filed them away in his mind, Poirot summoned Althea and Daphne to the gallery. They both arrived with bewildered expressions. He was waiting for them, sitting in his favourite armchair by the window, holding the jewellery box. Madame Cardew, Mademoiselle Daphne, it's time to talk about the false bottom. Althea raised an eyebrow. Daphne tensed. What are you talking about? Mrs. Cardew asked coldly. From the hidden compartment in the piano. There, I found this. Poirot placed the jewellery box on the tea-table. And inside, a letter that your husband, Monsieur Leonard Cardew, wrote shortly before his death. A thick silence fell over the gallery. Daphne was barely breathing. Althea didn't blink. In that letter, Poirot continued, your husband confessed to having embezzled funds from his company. He did it alone, without his partner's knowledge. And when Hector Blunt discovered the embezzlement, he threatened to go to the police. Leonard wouldn't let him. He falsely accused him of fraud, and Blunt disappeared. It can't be, Daphne exclaimed. My uncle would never. Your uncle was a man of order, but also of fear, mademoiselle, and fear can turn men into criminals. This letter was his attempt at redemption. He didn't dare deliver it while he was alive. He hid it. And the objects? Althea asked quietly. The medallion belonged to Blunt. The money. It was part of the stolen goods. Her husband kept both as a personal punishment, or perhaps as a way to remind himself of his debt. So Blunt, Daphne murmured. Blunt came back for that. Not just for that. He came back for justice, for his name, and perhaps to strike the final blow if no one acknowledged the truth. Because there's something more. Poirot leaned forward. Last night, someone posted a new letter on my door, unsigned, of course, but it said, I'm not looking for revenge anymore. I just want them to say his name, not bury him in lies." Althea put a hand to her chest. "So, he's still alive." Poirot nodded slowly. "Yes, madame, and it was very close. As close as a ghost that doesn't need chains to make a sound." That afternoon, Poirot asked all the residents to gather in the main hall. They were all there. Althea, Daphne, James, Miss Cattell, Harrow, and Mrs. Inglethorpe. Even the young cook, nervous about being surrounded by gentlemen, was present. Poirot, standing in front of the fireplace, held the jewellery box in his hands. "Mesdames, messieurs," he began, "I've gathered you together because the mystery of the returning hat is no longer an enigma. It's no longer an object, but an act, a symbol of memory, of guilt, and of truth. Everyone watched him with anticipation. The man many thought dead has returned, not to kill, not to steal, but to force us to look at what was hidden for years, so that history can be told in all its words. And that, my friends, it has already happened." Poirot gently closed the jewellery box. Justice doesn't always come with handcuffs. Sometimes it comes with a silent act. A hat on a ladder, a letter under the door, and a name that can never be forgotten. That night from his bedroom window, Poirot saw the path through the trees for the last time. There was no apparition. There was no bowler hat, only the fog drifting away, and the unmistakable feeling that the man who hadn't quite died had finally departed in peace. Chapter 7. The Melody of Repentance. At dawn, a new silence fell over Beechwood Manor. It wasn't the tense stillness of the previous days, nor the feigned calm that creeps in between secrets. It was, rather, a sigh, a kind of rest that only comes after what needs to be said is said. Poirot ate breakfast alone that morning. Mrs. Cardew didn't come downstairs, and Daphne excused herself with a headache. In the dining room, Poirot savoured his coffee slowly. Each sip seemed to mark the closing of a chapter. But that wasn't the case, not quite yet. After breakfast, he went upstairs to the oldest wing of the house. He hadn't set foot in that part since his arrival. There, behind a door with a rusty brass handle, was the Cardew family's attic. The air was thick with dust and memories. Boxes labelled with names from decades past, trunks with padlocks worn by time, and in one corner, a long black bag covered in cobwebs. Poirot carefully took it down and opened it. A cello not old, but well preserved, with a small silver plaque inside, "Property of H.B. Hector Blunt." Later, Poirot asked to see Daphne. In the music gallery, the young woman appeared without makeup, without the forced composure of previous days. Only her voice trembled slightly. "What's wrong, Monsieur Poirot? You talked to me about poetry, about sensitivity, but you never mentioned music." "I used to play," Daphne said, looking at the piano as if it were a grave. "And him? His uncle?" "No, my uncle hated music. He said it was a waste of time. That music only served to revive things that no longer existed." Poirot nodded, then placed the cello on the maroon armchair, right where he had found it. This instrument belonged to Hector Blunt. Apparently, he thought differently. Perhaps that's why Leonard Cardew found its presence unbearable. Perhaps that's why Music was the first thing to die in this house. Daphne leaned closer, touched the varnished wood with her fingertips. Her eyes watered, but she didn't cry. "Where did you find it?" "In the attic, hidden like everything Leonard wanted to forget. But it's not broken, just out of tune." Daphne carefully took the bow. She sat down. She placed it on the strings. Poirot walked slowly away and sat down on the window-sill. The first note was faint. Then came another. Then a brief melody. Almost a lullaby. "That's all I remember," she murmured. "I heard it once. When I was a child, on a stormy night, someone was playing it, from downstairs. Was she alone? I thought so. But now I think not. That someone was there. Maybe someone hiding. Maybe someone who never left." When Daphne finished playing, Poirot calmly stood up. "Mademoiselle, what you did this morning isn't just a musical act. It's an act of liberation. Sound has memory, you know. And music that resonates in a house can clear the air better than any confession. Do you think he heard her?" Poirot looked out the window, towards the forest. "I'm convinced. That afternoon, Inspector Bartram arrived from Southampton, summoned by Poirot a few days earlier. Poirot greeted him courteously, handing him Leonard Cardew's letter, the photograph, the camera recording, and the jewellery box with its contents. "I've left everything in order for you to proceed as you see fit," said Poirot. "But I warn you, the guilty party has already been judged, not by the law, but by life itself." Bartram looked through the documents, puzzled. "Are you saying Blunt is alive?" "He is, yes, but he's gone, and I highly doubt he wants to come back. He's served his purpose. He's been heard. And you, are you going to leave it like that?" Poirot smiled. "My duty is to tell the truth, Inspector. And the truth this time doesn't demand punishment. It demands memory." That evening, Mrs. Cardew went down to dinner for the first time in 2 days. She wore mourning clothes, not out of obligation, but as a symbolic gesture. Daphne accompanied her, and the two shared a much more amiable silence than they had in recent weeks. Poirot looked at them approvingly. "Sometimes," he said softly, "the hardest part isn't finding the culprit, but bringing music back to a house, once silent." And as the fire sparkled softly in the grate, and the cello slept in the corner like a peaceful animal, Hercule Poirot knew the mind game was over. But the melody was just beginning. Chapter 8. The Air of Lies. The day dawned clear, as if the previous night's wind had swept away the cobwebs of the past. The sky, clear for the first time in days, showed a pale blue over Beechwood Manor, and the windows shone with a new light. However, inside the house, Poirot knew that the most persistent dust wasn't the visible dust. It was the dust that accumulated on the names, the signatures, and the wills. At mid-morning, Poirot requested a private meeting with Mrs. Cardew in her study. She agreed without complaint, although her steps toward the room were those of a woman who knew that beyond the door an unavoidable truth awaited her. The late Leonard Cardew's study was spare. Dark wooden bookcases, a frosted glass desk lamp, a locked glass cabinet containing contracts, stocks, and legal documents. Poirot didn't sit down. He stood in front of the unlit fireplace while Althea sat in the high-backed armchair. "Madam," he said softly. "There's one last piece to this puzzle. It's not shaped like a hat or smells like the forest. It's made of ink, and it has a last name." Althea narrowed her eyes. "What do you mean?" Poirot took a thin folder from his jacket and placed it on the desk. When Inspector Bartram reviewed the documents I provided, he decided to check the local notary's records. He did it purely as a formality. But, as you well know, order is the spice of life. And what did you discover? Poirot opened the folder. He took out a letterhead and slid it towards her. A codicil, appended to Leonard Cardew's will, dated 3 weeks before his death, signed and witnessed by 2 people still living. In it, her husband acknowledges the existence of an illegitimate child, an heir, someone born from a past relationship with a French woman named Emily Dupont. Mrs. Cardew paled. Her voice came out as a whisper. "That's impossible. Unlikely, perhaps, but not impossible. The child's existence was not disclosed, of course. Leonard kept it a secret, at first out of pride, then out of guilt. However, according to this document, he had decided to legally acknowledge the child and grant it part of his estate." "And who is it? Where is it?" Poirot didn't reply immediately. He walked slowly to the window and looked out into the garden, where Daphne was chatting with young James, the maintenance assistant. "That young man," Poirot said without turning around. "James didn't come to Beechwood by chance. He came following a lead. His mother died last year, but before that she revealed her origins. A surname, a first name, and a confession. Leonard Cardew was his father." Althea jumped up. "That can't be true. Never told me. He never mentioned, or even hinted at." Poirot looked at her ruefully. "Because he kept it from you even. And yet he left a record. Your signature is here, madam. And the letter James found among his mother's things matches Leonard's statement word for word. There is, as always, one thing that survives the silence: the ink. And what do you intend to do? Tell Daphne? Ruin her with it now? No, madam, it's not my place, but you can't avoid it forever. James isn't after money. He just wants to know where it comes from. He doesn't want this house. He just wants to know if it really belongs somewhere. That afternoon, Poirot found James in the greenhouse, repairing a gutter with borrowed tools. "Monsieur James," she said gently, "would you walk with me for a moment?" They walked in silence to the bench by the pond. The water was still, reflecting the clouds. "You found it, didn't you?" James asked without looking at him. Poirot nodded. Leonard acknowledged it, not publicly, but he did, and in his own writing. "You are the son of Emily Dupont," and Léonard Cardew knew it. He tried to do the right thing, but death came faster than his redemption. James looked down. "And now? Now, it's your decision. You can take your legal place, yes. But the real decision is another. Do you want to stay, or have you gotten what you came for?" James was silent for a long moment. Then he murmured, "I didn't come for money. I just wanted to know if it was a shadow or a root." Poirot smiled slightly. "Roots, monsieur, don't always grow in solid ground. Sometimes they grow in the midst of ruins, and yet they survive." That evening, Althea Cardew descended into the drawing-room, as if each step took her years. She addressed James bluntly, in front of everyone present, including Poirot and Daphne. Your mother was a good woman. My husband failed her. And I failed by not asking more questions. You deserve to know you're not an intrusion here. It's part of this story." James nodded, his eyes moist. Daphne looked at him for a long moment, unsurprised. Then she simply took his hand. Poirot, standing aside, watched the scene with a serene expression. "A name, a hat, and a letter," he murmured. "And with that, the lie dissolves." That night in his notebook, Poirot wrote one last line before turning off the lamp. "Where crime leaves shadows, truth can still make the dormant blood of a family name bloom." Chapter 9. The Revelation in the Portrait. The atmosphere at Beechwood Manor had subtly changed. Although the halls were as silent as ever, it no longer seemed a silence imposed by secrets, but by reflection, as if the entire house were digesting the truth that had finally surfaced. That morning, Poirot remained in the library, leafing through a red leather-bound volume of local history. He wasn't doing it for pleasure. There was one lingering question that hadn't yet been fully answered. Why now? Why the return of the hat, the message, the letter, at the moment? Daphne's voice brought him out of his thoughts. "Monsieur Poirot, there is perhaps something you should see." She held a wooden frame in her hands, wrapped in a white sheet. She held it as one might hold a fragile object, not because of the glass, but because of what it represented. "It was in the attic. I found it last night while I was looking for some sheet music. It's a portrait of my uncle, although different from the ones hanging in the hallways." Poirot sat up. Daphne carefully removed the sheet. The portrait showed a much younger Leonard Cardew, standing in a velvet-curtained room with a lit crystal chandelier in the background. Beside him, in the background but clearly present, was the same man from the old photograph, Hector Blunt, and behind them, a third figure. "Who is it?" Daphne asked quietly. Poirot approached. He studied the face. Young, dark-skinned, serious. He was holding a folder. He wasn't in the central pose, but he was there. Not as a guest, but as someone who belonged. "That, mademoiselle, is your father," said Poirot, pointing to Leonard. "That's Mr. Blunt, and the young man in the background, he has been the Cardew family's notary for 25 years. Why is he there too?" Poirot narrowed his eyes. Perhaps he wasn't just a notary. Perhaps he witnessed something more. He slowly turned the frame, inspecting the back. There, almost erased by time, was a pencil inscription. "Settlement, Meeting, Beechwood, 1911. Signed under all three names." Poirot repeated in a low voice, "3 names!" He quickly set the portrait aside and went to the document case. He'd glanced at it a few days earlier, but now he was looking for something very specific. A deed, a contract, and, after minutes of searching, he found it. A yellowish sealed envelope. Header, Partnership Agreement, Cardew, Blunt, and Merriweather. "Merriweather," repeated Poirot, returning to the portrait. "That's the name of the young man in the picture. What's so important about it? Very much so, mademoiselle. Because until now, we had believed that Leonard Cardew and Hector Blunt were the only actors in the corporate conflict. But it wasn't a duo. It was a trio, and one of the 3 vanished without a trace." That afternoon, Poirot asked to speak to Mrs. Inglethorpe, the housekeeper. The woman, always dignified, was not surprised to see the portrait. "I hung it up with my own hands," he admitted, "when it first arrived home. It was in the study until Mr. Cardew decided to take it down. He said he didn't want to remember those days. What do you know about that third man? Mr. Merriweather. He was discreet, but perceptive. I suspect he knew more than he was letting on. He distanced himself from the Cardews shortly after Blunt's accusation. He left the country. He never returned. They called him the silent witness. Because? Because he didn't deny it, but he didn't confirm it either. I never heard him defend anyone. Only once did I hear him say something strange. I'm not a judge, but I am an archivist. History will find its time." Poirot smiled, and that moment has arrived. That night Poirot worked late in his room. He sorted through the documents, cross-referenced names, dates, and copies of signatures. Finally, he extracted a single piece of paper, folded in 3, the codicil to the will. He compared it with the signature on the 1911 deed, and then with a letter signed by Merriweather in 1913, found among the old papers. The writing was identical. But then, Poirot murmured, the codicillet was not written by Leonard Cardew. It was written by Merriweather post-mortem. By will or by fault, it wasn't a forgery. It was a restoration, a voluntary reconstruction of what Leonard would have signed, perhaps even dictated in words. But someone wrote it for him, after his death, so that James would have what belonged to him. Not legally, perhaps, but morally. Dawn, Poirot wrote a new line in his notebook. When truth cannot find a writer, time chooses a witness to complete it. And under it, one more. The portrait revealed not only a face, but the hand that wrote what the guilty party dared not sign in life. Chapter 10. The Voice Behind the Last Door. The atmosphere at Beechwood, though calmer, still held a shadow. Poirot felt it in the echoes of the corridors, in the fleeting glances of the staff, in the barely contained tension that hung in the air. The truth had emerged, yes, but not completely. A voice was missing, one that had remained absent, not out of fear, but out of calculation. And that voice, Poirot already knew it, was behind a door he had not yet opened. After breakfast, the detective headed alone to the south wing of the mansion, where the less-used rooms were located, some of which had been locked since Leonard Cardew's death. One in particular, the one that had been the deceased's private study, had been sealed for years. Althea claimed she hadn't touched it since the funeral. Daphne had never dared enter. But Poirot had the key. He had received it the night before from Mrs. Inglethorpe, accompanied by a whispered comment. He kept it on his watch chain. I never knew why. Poirot put the key in the lock. He turned it. Clack! He gently pushed the door open. The room was dim, the thick curtains still closed. The air was thick, smelling of aged leather and dried ink. There was a large oak table, a dusty lamp, and on a shelf what looked like a music box, long forgotten in time. But what caught Poirot's attention was the table. More specifically, a wooden filing cabinet with hidden compartments. Poirot inspected it. One of the drawers seemed shorter than the others. He slid it open, and as he suspected, there was a false bottom. Inside, a black-covered notebook. Worn, but intact. He opened it. It was a diary. Leonard Cardew, in his small, meticulous handwriting, had recorded his thoughts during the last months of his life. The first pages were bland. Business, complaints, about staff, health concerns. But as Poirot read, the deceased's voice began to reveal more nuances. Guilt, paranoia, fear. Blunt isn't dead. I knew it the moment the letter arrived with no return address. I didn't show it, I burned it. But his voice was in every word. I made a mistake. I thought hiding everything would be enough. But no, the boy, that James, I saw it in his eyes. He's mine. I can't deny it any more. But if I say it, Althea, she'll leave me. Merryweather came to see me. He offered to write what I couldn't sign. He asked me to leave a record. I didn't want the blood to be lost among the papers. I gave him permission. In his own way, he's more honest than I am. Poirot closed the notebook. So it was true. Leonard no signed the codicil, but gave his consent. It was Merryweather, the absent witness, who drafted the document for him as a final act of justice. And in doing so, it became Leonard's last voice, not a voice of confession, but of surrender. When Poirot descended with the diary in his hand, he found Daphne in the drawing-room, playing the piano with a melancholy softness. The melody stopped, went back, and started again, as if doubting itself. Mademoiselle, Poirot said in a measured tone, I've read your uncle's voice at last, and his fear too. Daphne turned around, confused. Fear? Afraid of you, that you would discover what he had done, that you would see him for what he truly was, not a monster, but a weak man. And it was. Poirot considered the question for a moment. He was, but he was also someone who, in the end, wanted to make amends. He didn't have the courage to confess, but he had the good sense to allow someone else to do so on his behalf. He handed her the diary. Daphne took it with trembling hands. Do you want me to read it? When I'm ready. Not to judge him, but to understand that even those who remain silent speak, if you listen closely. Later, in the garden, Poirot found James mending a fence. He approached leisurely. Monsieur, he said calmly, you have nothing left to look for. Your father not only recognized you, he also wanted you to know that he wasn't the man he pretended to be. James nodded, continuing to work. Thank you, Monsieur Poirot, not for the answers, but for not forcing them. Poirot tipped his hat with a slight bow. The most delicate mysteries, monsieur, are not solved. Listen. That evening, Poirot dined alone in the ground-floor dining-room. While sipping his coffee, he took out his notebook for the last time. He wrote, Every house with secrets has an unopened door, and behind that door there isn't always a dead body. Sometimes there's a voice. And on the last line, justice isn't always a verdict. Sometimes it's a truth written in shaky handwriting, tucked away in a diary, waiting to be read. Chapter 11. The Farewell on the Stairs. Morning unfolded over Beechwood with a strange luminosity. It was as if time, after so many days suspended between echoes of the past and half-spoken confessions, had finally decided to resume its course. The branches of the forest no longer seemed to guard secrets, but simply to dance in the wind. And on the stone steps where it all began, the first ray of sunlight caressed the step where so many times that Black Hat had appeared. Poirot, impeccably dressed, descended with measured stride from his room. His every gesture was that of a man who understood the weight of the closure. It wasn't haste that guided him, but an almost ritualistic respect for what he was about to conclude. Daphne was waiting for him in the hall. She was no longer dressed in grey or pale blue. She was wearing a dark red dress, simple but dignified, as if she had assumed a role that had been denied her until now. "He's leaving, right?" Poirot smiled slightly. "That's right, mademoiselle. Trains wait, and adventures beer too, though some leave a more lasting mark than others." "Have you solved everything?" Poirot thought for a moment before answering. "Not everything needs to be resolved. Some things just need to be understood. And in this house, understanding has been more powerful than any punishment." Daphne looked down for a moment. "I read my uncle's diary, and he made me cry. Not because I felt sorry for him, but because I understood he wasn't a villain. He was a man trapped in his own structure, so rigid that he didn't know how to undo the damage without hiding." Poirot nodded, gravely. "Sometimes the structure doesn't protect us. It locks us in. Leonard Cardew built his own cage with silences, with money, with pride. But in the end, it was a silent gesture, a letter, a dictated codicil, a hidden diary that gave him back some humanity. And James, do you think he'll stay? He'll know what to do. He's stronger than he looks. And Beechwood, it's not Leonard's home anymore. It's the home of those who still live there." Before leaving, Poirot took one last walk in the garden. The air was fresh. The flowers were more open. Everything seemed to respond to a natural cycle that for a long time had been disrupted by guilt. Now, balance was slowly returning. Near the fountain, he found young James sitting silently. Rudy carried no tools, no uniform, just an open book on his knees. "Monsieur Poirot," he said without. Looking up, "I didn't have a chance to thank you." "There's no need, Mr. James. My job was simply to push open a door that was already wanting to open." "I'll stay," James said after a moment. "Not because of the inheritance, not because of the name, but because this house belongs to me too, just as the unanswered questions my mother could never speak out loud belong to me." Poirot studied him closely. At that moment he saw a young man, not as the hidden son of an influential man, but as the legitimate heir to a redeemed history. "I wish you luck, sir, and peace. Both are difficult to find, but not impossible." The car was waiting by the main gate. The chauffeur had already loaded the luggage. Poirot, his hat perfectly positioned, took one last look at the facade of Beechwood. It was then that Althea Cardew appeared on the steps. She wasn't wearing mourning this time, just a light brown wool coat. She walked up to him with dignity. "He's leaving without fanfare," he said. "Like always." Poirot bowed slightly. "Discretion, madam, is the perfume of elegance. I want you to know something. I burned my hat last night." Poirot raised his eyebrows in surprise. A symbolic decision. More like necessary. That object was a spectre for too many nights. It was time to free everyone, even me. Poirot nodded slowly. "I understand. Sometimes it's not enough to tell the truth. You have to close the loop, and you've done it." Althea looked at him, a hint of gratitude in her eyes. "Will he ever come back?" "Only if the mystery demands it, madam." "I hope not." They said goodbye with a brief but genuine handshake. Poirot got into the car. As it pulled away along the beach-lined avenue, he glanced one last time at the steps. And there, right on the first step, he saw something. Not a hat, a flower, a freshly cut red dahlia, placed with the same precision as if someone had left a clue. Poirot smiled. Finished in his notebook. Already on the train back he wrote, "Where there was once silence, now there is memory. Where there was guilt, there is now room for truth. And where the hat returned, there is no need any more." Chapter 12. Epilogue. The reflection of the grey cells. The train glided smoothly through the English countryside, winding between rolling hills and sleepy stations. In a first-class compartment, Hercule Poirot sat silently, his eyes fixed on the passing landscape. Beside him, a porcelain cup held the dregs of cold coffee, and on his knees rested his trusty leather notebook. The Beechwood case had reached its conclusion, not with the explosion of a dramatic arrest or a public confession under the lights of the chandeliers, but with something more subtle, more profound, the restoration of moral order. And that, for Poirot, was even more satisfying. He took the notebook and looked over the last few pages. A series of crimes without corpses had written on one of them where the murderer was silence and the victim the truth. He closed the notebook. Then, crossing one leg over the other, he allowed himself a sigh, not of tiredness, but of closure. In his mind, the figures of Althea, Daphne, James, and even the absent Hector Blunt paraded by like pieces of a finally completed puzzle. And as was his custom, Poirot played with the enigma again from another angle, reviewing the invisible movements that only later became evident. "The small grey cells," he murmured, "they do not rest even when the case is resolved." He thought of Leonard Cardew, a man who lived imprisoned by his image, whose last will was delegated, not signed but heartfelt. He recalled the figure of Merryweather, the untried witness, who had been the scribe of a confession that needed to be revealed. And he thought, especially, of the hat, the symbol, the lighthouse, the silent rope that tied all the pieces together. It had been more than an object. It had been a presence, a warning turned into a message, a reminder that what is unjustly buried always finds a way to return. The voice of the train announced the arrival in London. Poirot put away his notebook and stood up with Swiss precision. As he disembarked at Paddington Station, he was greeted by a lead-grey sky and the courteous bustle of the city that never stopped. No one around him knew he had just closed a case whose resolution wouldn't make headlines, but had changed a family's life forever. As he walked along the platform, a child passing by with his mother pointed at Poirot's perfect moustache. The detective gave him a discreet wink and continued. He took a car to his apartment. Upon arrival, the routine returned like an old friend. Slippers by the couch, the samovar already prepared, the mirror perfectly clean, and of course, the peace of being back among things that were in their proper place. That night, as London murmured through the windows, Poirot wrote his last comment on the case on a fresh sheet of paper. Crime is a shadow cast by a wrong decision. Justice is not always achieved through arrests, but through restoring balance. And there are houses like Beechwood, where the real killer is a mission. Then, under that reflection, he wrote in larger letters, "Case solved. Method, psychological deduction. Key agent, memory. Result, the truth finally told." He closed the notebook. He turned off the lamp, and in the quiet darkness of his study, with the city whirring in the distance and his thoughts finally at rest, Hercule Poirot smiled, because once again the little grey cells had done their job. Chapter 13. The Letter That Didn't Arrive on Time. A week had passed since Hercule Poirot closed the case at Beechwood Manor. His return to London had been peaceful, his days filled with reading, walks and occasional visits from Inspector Japp, who was still sceptical about cases without a body or a guilty man in handcuffs. And yet, for Poirot, the case wasn't quite over. Not while one last question, a tiny but persistent doubt, continued to float in his mind. Why did Blunt choose that exact moment to return? Redemption, memory, the weight of the past, these were valid motives. And yet something else had prompted the movement, something that had yet to be revealed. It was then that a letter arrived. Poirot found it among his correspondence of the day, marked with an unusual origin address. Menton, France. The envelope, made of thick paper, smelled faintly of camphor. There was no clear return address, just neat, old-fashioned handwriting. Inside a single sheet, carefully folded, Poirot unfolded it. The letter was written in French. His heart stopped for a second when he read the first line. "Monsieur Poirot, if you are reading this, it is either because the truth has come to light, or because someone else has finished what I could not complete." Edie signed it Emily Dupont James's mother. Poirot sat down immediately. He took a sip of coffee, took out his notebook, and began to read. "I met Leonard in circumstances very different from those imagined by high society. He wasn't yet the cold man they describe. He was curious, privately tender, and completely unable to face the consequences of his decisions. When I found out I was expecting a child, he wrote me a single letter. 'I can't stay, but I'll send you help. Take care of him. He mustn't know I'm his father.' I never saw him again, but a year ago I received another letter. Not from him, from a guy named Merriweather. He said Leonard was sick. He wanted to make things right. He wanted at least to put the record straight. He didn't apologize. He just asked for the truth." Poirot stopped reading. Merriweather, again. It included a copy of the codicil and a photograph of James taken secretly, he said, from the conservatory gardens. I didn't want to tell my son anything. How could I tell him that his father didn't recognize him in life, but left his name as a secret legacy? However, I delivered the letter to him on his deathbed. James left shortly after. He said he wasn't looking for revenge, just answers. The last line was the most puzzling. But if you've ever met James, you'll know he didn't inherit his father's fear. Rather, he inherited something from you. That calm, non-violent way of searching. It comforts me to know that if you're reading this, he found what he was looking for. Poirot slowly put the letter away. There was something profoundly human, in her words. No drama, no judgment, just the voice of a woman who had maintained a silence for years, and who decided to break it just before disappearing from the world. But then he noticed the date, written a month before the Beechwood case. What if the letter was supposed to arrive earlier? What if someone with access to the correspondence had intercepted other versions? What if the hat wasn't the first warning, but the last resort? That evening, Poirot wrote a new entry in his notebook. Letters, like truths, don't always arrive in time. But when they do, they reveal that the mystery wasn't just the crime, but the decision to remain silent. And after a moment of reflection, a second line. Blunt didn't come back because the past was calling for him. He came back because someone, a mother, opened the door for him from the other side of silence. Poirot stood up. He turned off the lamp. The case was closed. But the echo of Emily, the true last witness, still resonated in his memory. Chapter 14. Echoes Between Crossed Lines. 3 days after receiving Emily Dupont's letter, Hercule Poirot found himself in his study, surrounded by silence and papers arranged with his typical precision. Although every element of the Beechwood case seemed to have fallen into place, the contents of that last letter still left him with an uneasy feeling of incompleteness. The fact that the letter had arrived late was not, for Poirot, a mere coincidence of the mail. In his world, anything seemingly fortuitous deserved at least a check. The truth, as he used to say, it is not fragile, but it is slippery. That morning, Poirot did something he rarely allowed himself. He reviewed the remains of the case from an emotional distance. He was no longer looking for culprits, but intentions. And that's how a small detail occurred to him: the name of the postman in Beechwood. During his stay, the mail arrived every day at the same time. And yet, one afternoon, when Poirot asked for someone to pick up a delivery in the village, young James had mentioned, "The new postman doesn't recognize me yet." Poirot remembered that clearly. "A new postman," he repeated softly, "but no official replacement. Interesting." 2 hours later, Poirot found himself in Inspector Bartram's office in Southampton. The inspector, a practical and somewhat impatient man, listened to the detective's request with scepticism, but agreed to make a call to the local postal service. "Yes, just a routine inquiry," Bartram said over the phone. "Was there any temporary replacement for the postman assigned to the Beechwood Manor area during the 2nd and 3rd weeks of last month?" "Uh-huh. What did you say?" "None." Poirot, from the chair by the window, raised an eyebrow. "Thank you. That was all." Bartram hung up and looked at him with a puzzled expression. "There were no replacements. The official postman, Mr. Dunning, wasn't absent a single day. And yet Monsieur James saw someone new, someone in uniform, and with their own agenda." That evening, Poirot returned to London with only one image in his mind: a man of average height, with an ordinary face, wearing a beret and a postman's jacket, someone who might have gone unnoticed. And yet, perhaps, someone who had placed or intercepted something in the Beechwood mailbox without anyone noticing. Who else would be interested in manipulating the timeline? The answer was not long in coming. Poirot found among his papers a forgotten note, scribbled in a firm hand. It was part of the testimony Gardner Harrow had given weeks earlier. A seemingly insignificant sentence. "I'll pick up the mail if Mr. Dunning can't make it, but I didn't see him last week. Just a younger man, very punctual with a strange accent." Strange accent? Poirot stood up. It wasn't the gardener who was lying. It was the mailman who was never a postman. The next day, Poirot travelled discreetly to Beechwood unannounced. He found James working with his hands full of paint, restoring the window frames. Daphne was in the greenhouse, and Althea in the library. The house, though still wrapped in a stately stillness, no longer seemed the same. But Poirot hadn't come to visit. He had come to look for one final clue. He asked James to see the mailroom. The young man led the way without asking. It was a small passageway between the kitchen and the basement, a low table, a hat rack, a wall with key hooks, and at the far end the slot that led outside. Poirot examined the wood around the opening, and there, barely visible in the slanting afternoon light, he saw a mark. 3 letters. R.N.V. Poirot touched the inscription. Then he took a step back. There you go! The ghost wasn't Hector Blunt. James looked at him, puzzled. What does it mean? Poirot didn't reply immediately. He took out a piece of paper and wrote down the initials. N. Fou. Do you see it now, monsieur, James? Haute? Poirot smiled slightly. Those letters match the name of Roland Neville Friend, retired notary, witness to his father's will, and, as I suspected, the invisible hand that wrote the codicil after his death. Are you saying he came all the way here? He didn't come as a notary. He came as a postman, for days, to keep watch, or to make sure certain letters arrived late, or never arrived at all. James frowned. But why? Why would I do that? Poirot looked out, where the shadows of the woods were beginning to stretch across the garden. Because, monsieur, although Merryweather, or Venn, as his real name is, believed he was doing justice, he also feared that the truth would destroy more than it would heal, and he wanted for a moment to stop the clock. That evening, back in his apartment, Poirot wrote in his notebook, "A crime committed in the name of silence, followed by a justice forged in darkness, and between them, a man who played at being, time." And under that reflection, one more note. Not all criminals seek evil. Some only fear pain. But fear, like poison, also leaves its mark. Chapter 15. The Notary's Last Confession. The next day, with the air thick with a distant storm and the London sky lower than usual, Hercule Poirot made an appointment with a man many believed to have retired from the world. Roland Neville Venn, once known as Merryweather in professional circles, lived in a discreet grey brick building in Highgate, having withdrawn from public life for over 10 years. Poirot arrived punctually, as always, with his moustache neatly trimmed and his ivory-handled walking stick. The doorman showed him the apartment without comment, although when he mentioned the name Venn, his eyebrows rose slightly. The strange gentleman who never receives visitors, he said without malice. The apartment was dimly lit, decorated with antique furniture, a collection of stopped clocks, and an asymmetrically hung Flemish tapestry. Venn himself greeted him in a blue velvet dressing gown, his thin face riddled with fine wrinkles like spider webs, his eyes still incredibly lucid. "Monsieur Poirot," he said in a raspy but firm voice, "I was wondering how long it would take you to reach me." Poirot inclined his head slightly. "Monsieur Venn, or should I say, Merriweather, according to the signatures of 1911. The old man smiled without joy. "Both names are mine. One for business, the other for things that shouldn't be revealed. And yet they came out. They settled in front of a fireless fireplace. Poirot refused tea, not out of distrust, but out of politeness. Venn poured himself a glass of sherry and held it with frail fingers. "It was a cowardly decision," he said without preamble. "Leonard asked me to write his codicil, but he died before signing it. Still, I completed it, not out of ambition or a desire to manipulate. I did it because the boy, James, had a right to know who he was, because blood shouldn't have to beg for its place." Poirot watched him attentively, without interrupting. "The problem," Venn continued, "was that I didn't trust the timing. I knew that if Emily's letter was delivered too soon, Althea would destroy any evidence. She had the power to erase the boy with a word." "And that's why he pretended to be a postman?" "Yes, it was simple. An old uniform from when my cousin worked at the post office. I wore a routine disguise. I entered the property without arousing suspicion. I left certain letters. I delayed others. All so that the moment would come when everyone was ready." Poirot raised an eyebrow. "And who decides when others are ready for the truth, monsieur?" Venn sighed. "That was my mistake. I thought I could control the pain. But pain, there's no calendar. And the truth, it doesn't obey fear." There was a long silence. The clock on the mantelpiece struck 12 with a dull clang. Neither man moved. "Did you come to denounce me, Monsieur Poirot?" "No, I came to hear the final piece of the puzzle, and to understand whether it was a forgery or an act of justice. I can see it was the latter, but imperfect. Do you think the boy has forgiven you? James didn't inherit his father's hatred. He inherited the desire to understand, and that's rarer than you think." Venn smiled weakly. His eyes moistened, but he didn't blink. "Then I can die in peace now." Poirot stood up. He took his hat. "Not so fast, Monsieur Venn. Tranquility doesn't come with death. It comes with order. And this story still requires one last line. Which? A written confession. Not for the police, for James. So he doesn't think the past was handed to him as a malicious secret, but as an untimely truth." Venn nodded. He stood up with difficulty and went to a carved wooden writing desk. He took out a blank sheet of paper, opened an inkwell, and began to write in a firm hand. Poirot watched him from the doorway. When the old man finished, he sealed the letter with wax and handed it to him. "Will you give it to her?" "My pleasure." That evening, back at Beechwood, Poirot wordlessly handed the sealed envelope to James. The young man took it, nodded, and went out into the garden to read it in the last light. Poirot did not follow him. He stood on the veranda, looking out at the woods. Daphne approached him silently. Was it him? Poirot didn't answer directly. He just said, Not all guilty people deserve jail time. Some only deserve to be heard, once. That night, Poirot wrote his last thoughts on the case. A notary who decided to write the truth when no one wanted to sign it. A son who didn't demand inheritance, but belonging. And a crime that was never a crime. Just an omission that demanded to be told. And he closed the notebook with firm hands. This time, at last, the silence was just. Chapter 16. Closing. The Inheritance of Shadows. A week later, Hercule Poirot found himself back in Beechwood. This time, not as an investigator. There were no more interrogations, hidden letters, or latent suspicions. Just a house that was beginning to breathe with a different rhythm. Less restrained, more human. The shadows hadn't disappeared entirely, but at least they were no longer hidden. Now they were part of the furniture of truth. The visit hadn't been planned. A simple letter from James. "I'd like to talk to you. It's not about the case. It's about what comes next," was enough for Poirot to board the train with his discreet carry-on bag and his unerring sense that important matters rarely end with a verdict. He was welcomed without ceremony, with a cup of tea and a seat by the window in the main hall. James and Daphne were there, waiting for him. Althea, too, sitting some distance away, holding a closed book. She no longer seemed the stiff figure she had before. Now she was simply a tired but curiously relieved woman. James spoke naturally. "I read Ven's letter." Poirot nodded without adding anything. "I wasn't surprised by what he said," James continued, "but I was impressed that he took the time to write it. He admitted his choices, yes, but also his powerlessness. He wanted to protect us. But, as you well know, Monsieur Poirot, overprotection can also be a form of harm." Poirot settled into his armchair. "And you? How do you feel now, monsieur?" "Different. I won't say everything's healed, but I've decided to stay. Not because of the heritage, not because of the family name, but because this place isn't just theirs anymore. It's mine now, too." Daphne looked at him with a mixture of pride and tenderness. She didn't speak much these days, but Poirot sensed that silently she had been the invisible thread knitting them all together. "And Mrs. Cardew?" asked Poirot, turning his head slightly towards Althea. She gently closed the book. "I've lost my husband for the second time," she said without drama. "The first time was when he hid his past from me. The second time was when I discovered he'd also excluded me from his redemption. But if I've learned anything these past few weeks, it's that even silence can have a language of its own, and I've begun to study it." Poirot looked at her with a respectful bow. "Then this house is in good hands." "I hope so," she replied, "because houses learn too, and Beechwood needed to forget in order to remember properly." Shortly after, Poirot was invited to tour the property. In the east wing, the former music room, the furniture had now been dusted. The piano, slightly tuned, looked less funereal. On a small table by the fireplace rested Blunt's cello, not as a relic, but as an object ready to be used again. "Daphne plays here in the evenings," James said. "Sometimes I read along with her. It's a silent ritual. Nothing is said, but something is building." Poirot nodded. Reconstruction is always more valuable than revelation. They stepped out into the garden. The air was warm, scented with blooming honeysuckle. The stone path no longer led to a mansion of secrets. It led, simply, to a house. And at the foot of the steps, where the hat had appeared so many times, there was now a small wrought-iron bench. No flowers, no plaques, just a place to sit. James had placed it there that week. To look without fear, he explained. Poirot smiled. And to wait without shadows. Before leaving, Daphne handed Poirot a small package wrapped in raw paper. A gift, he said. Nothing important. Poirot opened it in his room that night, back in London. It was a new notebook, bound in dark blue leather. On the first page, written in firm handwriting, was a single sentence. Every truth deserves a worthy witness. Poirot, deeply moved by his Belgian instincts, slowly closed the notebook and placed it on his desk. Then he poured himself a glass of liqueur, lit a reading lamp, and gazed at the city buzzing in the distance. This time, the case had not been solved with fingerprints or alibis. It had been a dance of silences. A war between what was unspoken and what was hidden out of fear, a crime of absence and a justice of presence. And as such, it deserved its own place among the strangest cases I had ever encountered. In his diary, he wrote, "The crime wasn't the murder, but the omission. The victim wasn't a body, but an identity. And the punishment was living with what was never said." Then one last line, under the date, Beechwood Case, concluded. Lesson learned. The human heart is the best hiding place, and the hardest. To open? End Chapter 17. The Man Who Came to Demand Silence. A month after the conclusion of the Beechwood case, as London drifted through the early autumn mists, Hercule Poirot received an unexpected visitor at his apartment in Whitehaven Mansions. It was mid-morning, and the detective was arranging the petals of a white orchid with geometric precision, when a sharp knock was heard at the door. Mrs. Lemon opened the door with her usual efficiency. Poirot heard a deep, polite voice and a surname he hadn't used in weeks. "My name is Julian Blunt." Poirot placed his tweezers on the desk and turned around curiously. The visitor was a man of military bearing, with a sharp face, about 40 years old, with intense eyes beneath a grey hat. He wore a long coat, and his gloves were made of a leather that had seen war or inheritance. "Come in, Monsieur Blunt," said Poirot in a calm but alert tone. "Are you related to Hector Blunt?" "I'm his son." Poirot offered him a seat. The man declined with a slight gesture, standing as if the conversation were a battle to be fought without support. "I'm here because I've read your report on Beechwood, part of it at least. The rest was told to me by an overly cautious lawyer." "And what do you want, monsieur?" "Not justice," Blunt said coldly. "Not revenge. I've come to claim the only thing that's mine. The right to know whether my father died, as a criminal, or as a man." Poirot studied him for a few seconds. "Your father didn't die a criminal, monsieur, nor a martyr. He was a man who returned from silence not to collect anything, but to warn that there was still a debt unpaid, and that debt wasn't monetary. It was moral." Julian Blunt took a deep breath. So why did he leave? Why didn't he show up? Why did he leave a portrait, a note, and then vanish, as if he'd never been there? Because he understood, Poirot said, gently, that justice doesn't always come with a name spoken aloud. Sometimes all it takes is putting a piece in its place. He didn't want glory, only balance. The hat, that was his signature. Julian finally sat down. His eyes, intense, now wavered. They told me he had played the cello. Once, Poirot confirmed, in the drawing-room where his reputation was destroyed. It was his way of announcing himself and saying goodbye. Silence settled between them. "And James?" Blunt asked more slowly. "Does he hate him?" No, he understood, not as a brother, but as another man who had fallen victim to the same spectre, the figure of Leonard Cardew. Julian closed his eyes. Then he opened them with renewed determination. "I want to go to Beechwood." Poirot nodded. "What for, sir?" "To hear the silence for myself, and to leave something behind." "That?" Julian reached into his coat. He pulled out a small black box. Opening it, he revealed a polished wooden pick with an inscription, "To my father. Sound is memory." Heche used to say that sound is the only way to remember without words. Poirot took the pick, examined it respectfully, and handed it back. "Then, sir, take her there, not to impose a presence, just to acknowledge her." Days later, Julian Blunt arrived at Beechwood unannounced. Daphne greeted him in the music gallery. James observed him silently, recognizing features that didn't belong to him, but that resonated with those of a shared ghost. "I didn't come to ask for anything," Julian said, "just to give back some of the sound my father tried to hide." He placed the pick on the cello frame. Then he went out into the garden. He didn't say anything else. That night, James played a short air melody. Daphne accompanied him on the piano. No one applauded, but the music echoed throughout the house as if the structure itself wanted to memorize it. In London, Poirot sealed a letter with no return address. Inside, a handwritten note. "I heard the music, and for the first time, I didn't feel the need to interrupt it." J.B. Poirot smiled and wrote a new entry in his notebook. "Even the heirs of silence can learn not to repeat it." And under it, another. "The Beechwood case is over, but its echoes will continue to tune the invisible strings of the soul." Chapter 18. Last Movement. The Symphony of Memory. Autumn had finally surrendered to winter when Hercule Poirot returned one last time to Beechwood. Frost embroidered the windows with natural filigree, and the once vibrant gardens slept beneath, a pale blanket of mist. It was his farewell visit, not to solve anything else, but to close the invisible book on a case that had been less a crime and more an examination of human hearts. James and Daphne were waiting for him in the music room. A fire crackled in the fireplace, and on the table next to the piano rested two familiar objects, Leonard Cardew's jewellery box and Hector Blunt's restored cello. "You know," Daphne said as she poured tea, "sometimes at night we hear a note, as if the instrument were breathing on its own. It's not scary, more like it accompanies." Poirot nodded understandingly. He approached the cello. It now had new strings. The varnish shone softly under the lamp. "There are instruments, mademoiselle, that preserve the soul of the person who played them. And this one," he touched the peg-box delicately, "has known redeeming hands." James chimed in from the fireplace. We received one more letter, unsigned, but it came with a dried flower inside, a red dahlia. It just said, 'Now I listen without fear.'" Poirot nodded. It was Julian Blunt, no doubt. The last heir to the echo. Justice, my friends, sometimes doesn't have the sound of a verdict, but rather the sound of a sustained note that finally finds resolution. Daphne lifted the piano lid and pressed a single key. The same note her Uncle Leonard had played before he died. But this time it didn't sound like a wail. It sounded like a suspended chord finally finding its place in the score. Poirot stepped into the middle of the room. He knew there was one last piece he hadn't yet delivered. "Before I leave, I must tell you something I've kept to myself until now," he said calmly, not because it was a secret, but because it had to mature. Like music. Daphne and James watched him closely. Poirot took a small worn notebook from his pocket, the same one Leonard Cardew had hidden in his study. But not all of its pages had been revealed. There was a final one torn out and kept secret. Poirot had kept it until he was sure the moment was right. He read it aloud. "If this diary is ever read, and if James ever hears it, let him know this. He didn't know how to love you, because I didn't know how to face what you were to me. But you weren't a mistake. You were proof. Names may hide, but blood doesn't lie. If there is a way to make it up to you, let it be this. Not the Cardew name. Not an inheritance, but the freedom. Not to repeat myself." Leonard C. James looked away. Daphne gently took his hand, and in that instant the house, the same one that had held so much repression, so many unspoken words, so many hidden letters, seemed to exhale. Poirot closed the notebook. And so, mes amis, the man who never knew how to be a father, learned, in the end, not to be an executioner. Silence. A different one filled with weight, but without pain. That evening, there was a small dinner in the Beechwood dining room. There were no toasts, no speeches, no ritual candlelight, just 3 people eating in harmony. James talked about restoring the greenhouse. Daphne mentioned an idea to turn the music room into a space open to young composers from the village. Poirot listened without interrupting. The future was beginning to raise its voice. As they said goodbye, Poirot shook both of their hands. Beechwood is no longer the home of crime or of secrets. It's now a place of memory and of music. James walked him to the car. Before Poirot got in, he handed him an envelope. "It's not a clue," he said with a smile. "It's just a thank you. Not for the detective, for the man who heard beyond the testimony." Poirot put the envelope away without opening it. It wasn't the time. In London, upon arriving at his apartment, Poirot opened the envelope. Inside, a handwritten score. No title, no author, just a sentence. In the margin, last move, for the grey cells. Poirot smiled. Then, in his diary, he wrote the final entry in the case. The crime was to remain silent. The victim, a generation. The punishment, living in repetition, but this time the music won. And then, as a final rubric, Beechwood case, absolute conclusion, justice achieved, inheritance accepted, silence is no longer the enemy. He turned off the lamp, and while the city slept, Hercule Poirot, satisfied, Finally, let his mind rest.